will come to tomorrow or later, but it is important to be respectful towards the schedule. So, I would like to start with a provocation, which is a question. It is possible to fall in love with a doll or a statue. Of course, it's not my personal question, but the question asked by more than 18th century visitors of the Regio Museo di Fisica e Storia Naturale at the present La Specula Museum. Actually, visiting La Specula, we come across, amongst other things, precious wax objects molded between the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. In the workshop, personally and inflexibly, directed by the scientist Felice Fontana. On the birth of this institution and activity of modelers, a vast literature already exists, and I don't want to talk about it. As for me, I'll try to analyze the female anatomical character of the Venus. Here, I introduce you the so-called Venus de Medici, one of the most significant clichés emerging from the Florentine collection, as well as its spin-offs, above all those in Vienna and London. But Venuses, supposed to be the exact reproduction of the Florentine one, are almost everywhere. It is a raw map of the Venuses de Medici all over Europe. Here I indicated only the principal ones made directly with the same casts or by the same artists, but there are many others only ideally inspired by the Venus de Medici. My choice is based on emotional impact this particular object has had on visitors over the centuries, which has been witnessed in first-hand accounts, often revealing aspects censored in the official narratives of physicians and experts. This talk aims at showing how the significance of a scientific object, to quote Laurent Destin, is constantly redrawn on the basis of the semiotic setting where it is inserted. As you probably know, in 1765, Peter Leopold Habsburg-Lorraine became the Grand Duke of Tuscany and soon conceived the idea of transforming the Grand Ducal collections into a public, diffused museum, which would represent a sort of microcosm symbolically disciplined by the sovereign himself. Artificialia were sent to the Uffizi and Naturalia to the La Specula Museum, where the Regio Museo was founded in 1775. I quote, "In order to enlighten the public and making it happy by making it educated." So making it happy by making it educated. It is typical of the Enlightenment. According to the Grand Duke, Felice Fontana gave form to a kind of anatomical kaleidoscope where, I quote, "everything remains enclosed on shelf behind great and majestic glass panes, and at one glance," I emphasize at one glance, "everything is seen, everything is known. The symmetry that reigns inside and outside the cabinets, the order and the regularity of the pieces is such that it captivates the observer while it also instructs and delights him. The visitor was the new Adam who could know new things only by seeing and enjoy them." Convinced that, I quote, "a student can make more progress in 6 months with wax models than in 6 years with corpses," Felice Fontana was so taken with the idea of substituting for didactical purposes the parts of the human body with their wax copies, that providing each wax model with annotated watercolors, he tried to set up a kind of anatomical encyclopedia. Wax artifacts had a long religious tradition in Florence. From the 13th century onwards, there was a flourishing industry of wax ex-votos called voti. The sanctuary of Santissima Annunziata in particular collected these objects from all over Europe. The church became so full of wax simulacra that it was obliged to display them on the outside walls and to limit their increase with special legal sanctions. In the 16th century, it was already difficult to make room for the new ex-votos that accumulated daily. They were hung like lamps from the ceiling and sometimes fell to the floor, endangering pilgrims. In 1786, the Grand Duke decreed that the ex-votos be melted down in order to make candles. What I would like to underline here is that in this tradition, in the religious tradition too, we can identify the desire not only to represent the body, but to substitute the body with a fetish, which was symbolically donated to God through the intermediation of the church. This tradition expressed itself in Regio Museo too. The smaller anatomical pieces imparted to the rooms an almost reassuring aspect, halfway between a chapel and a butcher's shop. On the one hand, modeled directly from corpses and displayed on a jumble of wooden cases on the walls, they recalled reliquaries or ex-votos. On the other hand, in representing mainly reddish basalt fescals placed on pieces of white cloth, they created a familiar atmosphere not so different from that of a meat market. The collection was open to the entire public without distinction. Was the nakedness of the full-length status a problem for the local visitors? Not too much, we have to say, since the frequencies of families and women visiting Regio Museo was between a quarter and a half. For a Scot who visited Florence in 1770s, the, I quote, insensibility to nudities so widespread amongst Italians was due to the number of statues which decorated streets and squares in Florence, so that, I quote, ladies who have remained for some time in Rome or Florence acquire an intrepidity in examining and criticizing naked figures which is unknown to those who have never passed the Alps. What kind of philosophy did the exhibition betray? Human body was presented as a part of nature, in continuity with other creatures, of course. Felice Fontana shared the sovereign's belief in the fundamental importance of knowing and accepting natural laws, which according to what physiocratic doctrines claimed, in social-political dimension, gave expression to the Grand Ducal laws. Regio Museo taught that there was a divine order inside nature. It is another quotation. It is not possible to contemplate the structure of the human body without feeling convinced of some divine power. Only for people having a higher scientific education, the anatomical accuracy was of more concern than all the moral, philosophical, and religious implications. To sum up, anatomical education was of secondary importance to this project. Nevertheless, was not a problem for people living in Italy, perhaps. Actually, we can only give a negative evidence of it. Strangers, nevertheless, soon perceived the Florentine anatomical collection in general, and the Venus de' Medici in particular, as emotionally destabilizing, prurient, uncanny. What was so embarrassing? The Venus embodies the agony of a beautiful woman, of course. In Budapest version, the right leg, look at the leg, is raised as in a desperate attempt to cover what will be statistically uncovered. The head of the Bologna Venus reclines still further, while her body is arranged so precariously that she gives the impression of being on the point of collapse. The Vienna copy's gaze is directed elsewhere, as if she were offering herself up for sacrifice to a known torturer without daring to look at him. So it's not only my interpretation, but sources interpreted these postures this way. While the anatomical status, even in female ones of the Bologna school, this is the Bologna school by Lelli, for instance, Lelli said, the subject seem unaware of their fate. In the Florentine artifacts, especially the Venuses, they seem to be aware of what is happening to them, like conscious sacrificial lambs on the anatomical bed. The Venus seems to express a masochistic pleasure. She invites the observer to gaze upon her soft flesh and to enter her. And it is funny because the pearl necklace around her neck, serving to cover the slit in her throat, is an emblem of sensuality. But in the subsequent Venuses, the slit is here or is under the breast, but we have also the necklace because it is a symbol in itself, even when it has lost all the proper functions of its use. The Venus emanates a contagious sensuality. She is the specimen that provides the conceptual tools for reading each body in a sort of pan-erotic key. Always the painter Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was familiar with the nude bodies, was nevertheless shocked by the spectacle presented to her in 1792. Until that moment, I had never seen anything that had made me feel such a painful sensation. But as soon as I glimpsed a life-size woman lying down that created a suggestive illusion, Fontana told me to go up to the figure and then, lifting a kind of covering, offer to my gaze her intestines, all twisted like our own. The sight made such an impression on me that I almost fainted. For many days it was impossible for me to distract my thoughts to the extent that I could not see anyone without mentally divesting them of their clothes and their skin. The Venus gives the observer the courage to declare what is before everyone's eyes, but no one dares to say. That is that man is ontologically naked, so to say. The Venus sharpens one's senses. Always, Madame Vigée-Lebrun says, when I saw Fontana again, I asked his advice as to free myself from the relentless sensibility of my organ. I feel too much, I told him. I see too much, perceive too much, even from afar. So senses are sharpened by the presence of the Venus. The turmoil of the senses is thus a sort of rite of passage that frees the imagination and ideally leads to a greater maturity. And perhaps that's why anatomical wax models were used to show the girls of the upper society, of the upper class, shortly before the marriage, the secrets of their bodies. So they were used for erotic and sexual education. Wax models revealed the secret core of a sexuality that should never leave the borders of a monosexual community. In Italy, men and women could visit together this wax orgy, but it was a scandal for people coming from outside. And this is why Lady Blessington judged the spectacle so appalling that she wished for separate visitors for men and women. But the problem is that the Venus is pregnant. And we know it only only at the end of the visit. As often happens in anatomical depictions of the female body, the woman contained in a glass is herself a biological case or a container. And so her virginity is only superficial. Here I made a sort of artisanal animation of the Venus. I peeled the Venus layer after layer, and at the end of our voyage we discovered that she is pregnant. The modern observer is struck, or could be struck, by the fact that in a wax model, in an anatomical collection, the main aim of which should be the naturalistic representation of a body, there is an incongruity between her pregnant uterus and the rest of her body. Morphologically, the Venus is a not pregnant woman in whose uterus a fetus has been inserted. The young woman's stomach is not distended, nor her breast enlarged, nor are there any other of the other physical changes that accompany pregnancy, so to say. So the wax model is an ideal topography of the female body rather than a realistic representation of a pregnancy. It indicates a reproductive potential, not an actual gestation. The Venus is a pregnant virgin, like the Virgin Mary. The fetus, moreover, is too small to be so well formed. The pregnancy, therefore, is merely symbolic. And how, this is, for instance, another pregnancy, but of Spanish school, to show how a man can represent pregnancy in in a realistic way. So it is not an idealization like the waxes in Florence. So now the gender perspective. What distinguishes the male status from the female? Even though anatomical differences between the two sexes, especially differences in bone structure, have been recognized for some time, the wax models in Reggio Museo do not seem to take this into a great account, giving the male the role of unique anatomical subject, as was indeed common. So instead of following this direction, it seems more profitable, as Ludmila Giordanova's illuminating observations suggest, to identify dichotomies around conceptual and representative nodes which can offer an image of the culture that produced and received, of course, wax models of both sexes. So the first dichotomy is passion versus lack of passion. The Venus is passionate. She is dominated by her emotions, which transpire in her face or in the voluptuous gesture of a hand nervously scrunching a lock of hair, in this case, for instance. The Apollo and the statue, inspired by the engraving by Albinus, on the other hand, do not convey a particular erotic thrill, despite the sense of physical vigor. The male standing subject is attractive, as neoclassicism decrees, or better, while feeling pain, he exerts self-control in order to betray his suffering. Remember that we can represent a man suffering too. This is, for instance, a wax model of British tradition, which is more realistic. And the difference between this kind of representations and the representations in Florence is paramount, I think. Another dichotomy, horizontal versus vertical. The woman is almost always supine. This naturally does not mean that the wax male figure is never horizontal, but that there is a choice between the two positions, at least. If there is a superimposition between the horizontal and the passive, the vertical and the active, then the woman is almost always passive, whereas the man can fulfill both roles. In this case, it is a man who is passive. While the standing male figures don't seem to feel the torture inflicted on them, the reclining male figures like this have more pained expressions. It is as if being horizontal decreed their, so to say, feminization and passivity. Viscera versus pre-surface. In 18th century medical theory, women were considered to be particularly emotive since they were animated by a physiology connected with their viscera. The female models proffer themselves to someone who removes their intestines, lungs, and other organs from their abdominal cavity. It is a subsequent wax model of the Spitzer Museum. In this hodgepodge, the uterus is the gravitational center. The body of a woman is constructed around its uterus. Even when not in a state of gestation, the uterus still occupies a central place in the ideal female topography. The female body is constructed around its uterus, over which all the other organs are arranged. So the woman is a full box, a box inside which we can find the uterus, which is the piece of resistance. The man, on the other hand, is the model chosen to give form to the pre-surface, that is, to the most visible muscles, but not the skin. His virility is expressed by the harmony of the muscular forms, which are contrasted with the softness of female tissues. This is a male, for instance. When used to illustrate the more internal parts of the body, the male is generally empty, a container without contents. For instance, in the statue exhibiting the circulatory system, this is the statue in question, the model seems to have been emptied out. The only important organs left inside are the heart and the kidneys. The male subject is cardiocentric, the female uterocentric. The female around the uterus and the male around the earth. Everything in the male model refers to the surrounding pre-surface. The inside, a great vacuum around the earth, exists only in order to emphasize the outside. So the man is an empty container. Modularity versus stratification. Representations of the body generally follow two different systems of representation, topographic and systematic. The first depicts all the organ in a given zone, as well as nerves, vessels, and connective tissues. Portrayal of the woman as a full box follows this type of histological variety. The female statue is modular. Indeed, the Venus is composed of pieces that can be extracted, admired, studied, and replaced. Though they cannot be dismantled, the other female figures nevertheless give the same impression. In this sense, the young women of La Specola are close to the manipulable model, which can be dismantled and reassembled, that Fontana sought to construct out of wood in the last year of his life. So it is a model we can find in prairies, and it is manipulable. And the logic of the female wax model is similar to that. The male wax model has a greater histological unity, and so it is more often associated with a systematic representation, which tends to depict parts belonging to the same system, bones or muscles, nerves, etc., while neglecting the rest as far as possible. The male body does not have removable parts. It is composed of apparatuses that stratify its surface. To see into it more deeply, one has to peel it. Here is the new Marcia. So it is the difference. The woman is Venus and the man is Martius in the technique of making the waxes. Dichotomy number 5, soft versus hard. The woman is chosen to give form to soft tissues, usually in the abdominal area. Moreover, only the female wax model are covered in skin, which gives an illusion of soft sensuality. The man, on the other hand, is chosen to depict hard tissues, never covered in skin. His representative nucleus is composed mainly of muscles, and in the male subject, veins and arteries are turgid and chromatically intense, sometimes to the point of being scarcely credible. In 1780, during the stay in Florence, the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, Grand Duke Peter Leopold's brother, visited Reggio Museo and was so impressed by the collection that he asked to have the anatomical wax models reproduced. Once arrived, they were exposed to the Josephinum. They are still there in Vienna. Actually, wax models arrived in Vienna when a professional conflict was going on through a crucial phase, the struggle between physicians and surgeons on their respective status and competences. Physicians felt outraged by the visibility of surgeons. Physicians considered anatomical models to be toys and nothing more. The objects were not so different from the popular figures in wax hosted in Joseph Müller's Wax Museum. The nature of these artifacts was not necessarily scientific. On the contrary, some of the wax figures produced in Vienna in these years had explicitly pornographic purposes, but the controversy was very long. The continental tradition of wax anatomical models arrived in England in the early 18th century. In the early 19th century, anatomical wax exhibitions relied on full-length, i.e. anatomical Venuses produced in Italy, France, and Germany. For instance, even a Florentine anatomical gallery was set up in London. Actually, the adjective Florentine was only a brand, a synonym for anatomical, and revealed an exotic backdrop which had Florence at its epicenter and the banner of a charming as much as imagined Renaissance. It was in 1834 that the first wax statue with the explicit commercial name of Florentine Venus made its appearance in London. It had been molded by Antonio Serantoni, and it was identical to that conserved in the Reggio Museo. I found in La Specola the authorization to reproduce the Venus which was displayed there. Then, in 1839, another Florentine Venus came to attention of the London news. We have many ephemera about it. Its features evidently recalled the archetypical ones of the Venus de' Medici on display at the Reggio Museo. One first clear difference could not escape anyone who had actually been to Florence, and that's the fact that the Venus is dressed. But in England we are in the Victorian culture which doesn't allow to expose, to exhibit naked bodies. So, to conclude, in Florence, the man-woman alternative had found its result in the two ideal figures of Venus and Apollo. In London, instead, rising to the role of the male archetypical man was Adonis, a minor god even represented prone to show his posterior musculature and backbone. It is a sort of reductio of the figure, of the male figure, because it is dressed and because it is prone and because it actually represents not the real Adonis, but the statue of the hermaphrodite who was conserved at the Uffizi Galleria for a long time. And then there was another Venus which was Moorish, that is black, so the history is very complicated. I conclude. In a century of life, the Florentine Venus lived out its own parable, from a valuable model displayed in a Grand Ducal Museum to a copy, exhibited together with objects of all kinds in town fairs. From a tool for teaching anatomy to an entertainment attraction. So it is another anatomical Venus who can breathe. You can find it at the museum Madame Tussauds in London. A wax statue, above all in the British Isles, was now a toy, in presence of which to feel a wonder that had nothing to do with knowledge. Enlightenment had finished, and the modern entertainment industry was in the meantime born. Thank you. So I liquefied like the blood of Saint Januarius. But if there are any questions, if you survive, if you're still alive, you can ask, please. Please.
It is not a question, actually. I am challenging the position of the necklace and simulating as covering the neck cuff.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, the Florentines do it better because Fontana numbered like an artist way, and when they go, they put a number. First, second, is and combine, for example, any drawing. Well, Fontana put one necklace on the first one Venus, the second was for the brother, the Austro-Italian emperor, a copy, and he put two necklaces. The third one was bought by the cardinal and sent to Bologna as not three necklaces here. So it is a way of saying I am producing for art and this is my copyright.
It's a reality.
What is important is when I am studying now the quality of the material inside the necklace. Well, unbelievable. It is not a pearl, of course. It is not only glass, as it seems possible, but it is wax, white wax inside the pearl. And what happened in Vienna, that Venus, is that during the restoration
a couple. So, as far as the wax models are concerned, yes, they incarnated a sort of impossible love, so with a high society woman. And this is why Felice Fontana, who was the director of La Specola, was a very strong man, each time asked to Clemente Susini, the artist in charge of molding the waxes, to reshape the genitals of the women, because the men in particular touched the genitals of the women, and they were deformed after a while, after a couple of months. As far as the visitors, there are wonderful studies made by Renato Mazzolini, for instance, who checked all the guest books to understand what kind of people visited this kind of collection, and he discovered that in Italy it was not a problem. At the beginning, we had two different schedules, so for normal people, for high-class people, for physicians. But in the 18th century, it was a sort of museum, but it was a wonder museum, so people could go there when they wanted to. And I think it's the fundamental difference between the Enlightenment museums in Italy and in England or in Germany, where men and women were not allowed to stay together because they can cross their glance and it could be a sin. So that's why the strangers are so curious of how Italian can appreciate the nudity without feeling in pain. And the Italians are Catholic, but they have no problems with nudity. I don't know if I answered your question. No, male were not touched. No, but you know, when they prepared the bodies, they used the bodies of the hospitals. So at the hospitals died only people who had no family. In general, the anatomical subjects were of the, not of high society, of course, but they were, so to say, transformed through the death, and they became anatomical models. It is like the same thing you do with plastination, Gunther von Hagens. So through some procedure, you want your body to be immortal, perfect, and not prone to decomposition. So it is a post-mortem aesthetics. Non so se... Laura. Yeah.